We had the Wisconsin Supreme Court race yesterday. Conservatives were making a big stink about their wins in Florida. Their wins included losing ground in two safe Republican districts. You know, Gates and Waltz both tried to move on and be members of the Donald Trump cabinet. Only Waltz was successful because people didn't want Pizzagates out there, especially with all his shenanigans, so to speak, that he's taken part in. But the idea that somehow the MAGA made great gains yesterday by winning two seats that everyone was expecting them to win, but won them in with turnout that wasn't as good for them as they expected. I mean, the person who was, I guess, in the lead for a while, eventually lost, made a huge surge in, overall votes for the Republican versus her. But the Wisconsin Supreme Court race, backed, the Republican was backed and supported by Elon Musk. He donated people who voted in that election, or he gave $1 million, I guess, to two people from his PAC or whatever. He has, I guess, because he's an independent distributor of cars, apparently there's some rule in Wisconsin that prohibits Teslas from being sold, and I think Elon Musk is suing the state of Wisconsin in order to be able to sell Teslas in the state of Wisconsin. And, well, that seems to be a little bit of a conflict of interest there. I might actually agree with the premise of the Elon Musk lawsuit as a general principle that just because it's an independent distributor of a car and not going through a dealership, that shouldn't preclude people from being able to buy the cars. Now, I'm not going to cry a river over Teslas not being able to be sold over there, but the general principle of the thing, I might agree with that, but that doesn't mean you go buy an election. But he didn't buy an election. He wasted a whole bunch of money on an election that he lost. And this guy is supposed to be the head of, or at least temporarily, of the Department of Government Efficiency. This guy just spent millions of dollars and lost. That's not very efficient of you, is it? Nope, not one bit. So kudos to Judge Crawford, who defeated Brad Schimmel by 10 points. It's a 10-point win that Judge Susan Crawford had, being described as a decisive victory, giving the Supreme Court a 4-3 Democratic majority, despite the fact that the legislature is still Republican because of gerrymandering. You can see more on that, I think, at least in some of my Stop the Coup videos. I don't know if the Stop the Coup videos are still up. I might have to take them down because that whole thing that I was trying to do with it is no longer a thing. So, but anyway, she wins, but there's also something else that was passed that day. And I also wanted to talk about this because this is not just about her winning. A voter ID piece of legislation that would take the existing ID law in the state of Wisconsin and promote it to being a constitutional amendment in the state of Wisconsin. Right? So, and that passed. That also passed resoundingly. I think it needed 60% to pass. It got the 60% that it needed to pass. And here's the thing. We're going to take a look at the text of the law, and we'll discuss why it's not necessarily a horrible thing. Now, let's just, this being said, the vast majority of any crimes that are committed relating to election, like election fraud, voter fraud, or whatever, hardly any, if any of them, will be fixed by requiring a voter ID. Most places have ID laws already, but the amount of fraud that is done by somebody not having a valid ID is infinitesimal, and there is no evidence to show that anybody has swayed an election one way or the other because they didn't have a proper ID or they weren't properly allowed to vote. Why? Because of risk versus rewards. The risk of harm to yourself, the risk of imprisonment and fines or whatever you might get after getting caught for committing an act of election or voter fraud is not worth the amount of votes that you cast versus the chance of that one vote making a difference, or that additional vote, or those additional votes making a difference. Now, there are elections where one vote has been the difference. think one vote was the reason why we have the American eagle as our national bird instead of the turkey. That's at least what I recall. But that being said, I take no issue generally with the idea of show an ID to vote. Go up, show an ID to vote. Mexico does it, but Mexico does it by giving everybody a free ID and letting them use that to go vote. The problem with most of these so-called voter ID laws is that they include other provisions that do not contain anything that has to do with the requirement to show an ID to prove who you are. And the Republicans who pass these laws know that their supporters are gullible enough to think that just because it's called a voter ID law, that everything in that law pertains to voter ID. The North Carolina law specifically that was tossed out because the judge found that the Republican-controlled legislature targeted black voters of the state of North Carolina with such surgical precision. Like, they actually did a study on all the different ways that people cast ballots in the state of Wisconsin and only nixed the ones that were utilized by mostly by black voters. That's ridiculous, and that's racist, and that's an attempt to disenfranchise and make it harder for one class of people to vote as opposed to the other class of people to vote. Which is why I've always said, on this show and other places, if the Republicans would just pass a simple, standalone piece of legislation, or just present a standalone piece of legislation to the voters that would only require a voter ID, that it would pass. Because most voters would be like, yeah, you know what? There's nothing wrong with the idea in principle. The thing that's wrong with the idea is everything else that gets shoved into those bills. So, this piece of legislation is 11 lines long. 2025, let's see. There's more lines before it just kind of describing what's going on, but basically that resolved that the foregoing proposed amendment to the Constitution be submitted to a vote of the people at the election to be held on the first Tuesday of April in 2025, and be it further resolved that the questions concerning ratification in the foregoing proposed amendment to the Constitution be stated on the ballot as follows. Question 1. Photographic identification for voting. Shall Section 1M of the Article 3 of the Constitution be created to require that voters present a valid photographic identification, verifying their identity in order to vote in any election, subject to the exceptions which may be established by law. And those exceptions that may be established by law could very well be something like we do in Louisiana, where if you don't have a voter ID, but you have all the documentation that would be required to get yourself a voter ID and get yourself registered to vote or whatever, you can bring that information in to vote and still cast a ballot. Like, I think you need, if you have your birth certificate and 2 forms of bills or something, you can bring those in and be like, boom, there you go. And of course, Donald Trump's addition to that to try and make it where you have to use a birth certificate. You can't use something else. You have to have your marriage license if you're a woman or whatever. You know, that adds on additional complexities that are not needed. But if I'm fine with doing what Mexico does. For example, Mexico says everybody gets a free ID, and then you could use that ID to cast a ballot. Nothing wrong with that, because the government's paying for it. There's no additional cost out of your pocket, so it's not a poll tax. If the government is giving it to you, the effort that's required to do it is slim to none. Let's do it like that. And also, I have a video on the top 10 things about arguments with dealing with voter ID. Just if things like this, if we were to say this is okay and let's pass these things, you take it off the table. You take the whole issue off the table, and then you disallow the Republicans from doing the things like they tried to do in North Carolina, where they put in other ballot measures. So, but there's an additional thing here that's interesting. There's an additional thing here that's interesting, and this is part of a this discussion that I had on Facebook, and this is an example of me calling my shot. I've done this before, and I'll do it again. In fact, one of the things I think I've realized that I'm upset about is there was an example of me calling my shot with Jeff Carrera on WGSO, and I wish it's probably still on my old laptop. I probably have to pull it off. It was on Blog Talk Radio, and well, it's now gone with the way of the dodo because Blog Talk Radio is no longer a thing. But here is a screenshot. I've blanked out the names as best as possible. And this guy was very excited about the fact that Wisconsin passed voter ID. Next election should be interesting. That is, if the Democrats allow the will of the people to stand, we will see. If they are true to form, they'll try and use that slim 4-3 to overturn it, like they've tried elsewhere. Democracy be damned. Now, of course, democracy be damned is a silly statement. Because you don't have the ability or the right to vote for something that would be unconstitutional. Now, it's hard to say that you can't say that something that's in the state constitution now violates the state constitution, but it's very well possible that you could pass constitutional amendments to your state constitutions that would violate the federal constitution. So if it's possible that such a thing that was passed would violate the federal constitution, the voters of the state of Wisconsin don't have the power or the authority to override the Constitution. It would be like, let's say I ran for president, and I would never do this if I was a candidate for president. If I ran for president and I said, I'm going to sign an executive order to return us to chattel slavery. And the people were like, let's vote for Dan. Yes, vote for Dan. We like what Dan has to say, including that. And let's say I win the election with so many votes, and I have a mandate to do whatever it is that I want to do. And I signed an executive order saying chattel slavery is now legal. These idiot Republicans, these MAGA morons, would say, or if they were on my side at the time, would say, well, this is the will of the people, so clearly he should be able to do it. And if a judge were to stop Dan, let's say I was conservative Dan, if a judge were to stop Dan from implementing this executive order, what he ran on as when he ran for president, then they would be going against the will of the people. Well, guess what? The will of the people, it doesn't matter if they're trying to get you to do something that is blatantly unconstitutional. The will of the people, let's say we have a candidate who wants to end drinking again and ban and go back to prohibition. Well, prohibition is unconstitutional. But if we had a president that wanted to sign an executive order that did that, or that ran on that, and the people voted for him and then he tried to do it, these idiot Republicans would say, oh, he's an activist judge. He's a liberal activist judge going after our president who's trying to, do what we elected him to do. You can't vote for somebody to elect them to do something that is going to violate the Constitution. It just doesn't happen that way. But back to me calling my shot. So here we go. I say, let's make it larger. I would have voted for the amendment. Why? Because I don't oppose voter ID requirements. Most people don't oppose the requirement to show ID to vote, even though the amount of fraud that would be prevented by these laws is infinitesimal. The problem with these so-called voter ID laws, like they passed in North Carolina previously, again, because they contained other provisions related to a requirement to show an ID. In the North Carolina law specifically, the court determined that the GOP legislature specifically targeted black voters in those other provisions to make it harder for them to cast a legal ballot. But 90% plus of the time, I say all of these things, and some moron will ask me, what's wrong with requiring an ID? Enter moron. I agreed to the last couple of sentences. You are stating that black people are incapable of getting an ID? That's racist. If not, why don't they have a legal ID? Why are these people so stupid? Why are they so stupid and so predictable? If he read the last three sentences, he would know that I was predicting exactly what he was going to do. And he did it anyway. Like, you're a moron if you say that what's wrong with requiring an ID or something similar to that effect, and then he did it in the very next response. So I go down further, blah, blah, blah. There's no evidence today for ID laws to be unfair to blacks. A, you're supposed to capitalize black whenever referring to race. That's a typical style guide thing. But B, if you're still calling black people blacks, that just proves to me that you're racist. Yada, yada, yada. So I go, please reread what I wrote. The portions of the North Carolina bill that caused to be thrown out were the provisions other than the ID requirement, i.e. it was not a requirement that I was talking about. I even predicted that you do what you did before you did it, and you still did it. That's because y'all are predictably and willfully ignorant. In my next response, I also thanked him for giving me some good show content for my podcast tonight. So there you have it. And this is not the first time. If you go look at either, because I have two Facebook pages, I'm trying to use the facebook.com/liberaldanradio more often, but over on facebook.com/liberaldan itself, I also have several examples where I call my shots, where I took screen captures of people where I said, some idiot's going to do X, and then they do X, and it's always on this same issue. And this is what makes me mad. Not that they're stupid, not that they're ignorant, not that they're dumb or lazy or uninformed, but it's the fact that these dumb, stupid, lazy, uninformed people are able to join together in big numbers and still accomplish shit, like winning elections. These people are this close to drooling on themselves. They're so predictably dumb. Yet, they still manage to win. And it's frustrating. So what do you think? Do you agree with me that voter IDs are not going to change any amount of significant voter fraud, but yet I have no problem with putting them in anyway to get the topic out of the hands of the Republicans and stop the Republicans from using them to be able to shove in other deplorable things into legislation and fool their voters into thinking that all they're voting for is a voter ID requirement? Or do you disagree with me? Do you still think that I'm saying that voter ID laws that there's nothing wrong with voter ID and that you have to prove to me? Like, I guarantee you, like, here's a prediction. This is a video that I'm making, right? I'm making this video. I will almost guarantee you that there'll be at least one conservative out there who responds to this video that I'm making right here and will respond, what's wrong with requiring an ID? And not do it ironically. And when that happens, I want every one of y'all to respond to that person with a laughing emoji or whatever. Because, again, they're predictably stupid. So anyway, leave your comments down below. Remember to like the video, share it, subscribe to the channel, and unless you still think that I have a problem with voter ID and you want to say, what's wrong with the voter ID, or you're a Nazi, have a good day. I have to start recording this again just because Chad in the chat, what's wrong with requiring an ID? Chad in the chat just now says, what's wrong with requiring an ID? I know you're being funny. I appreciate the joke. Thank you for the laugh.